tenure of current Chief Justice Mogoeng Mogoeng comes to an end in the late 2021. Now, it will soon be time to start considering who should be appointed as the next Chief Justice. But the process is not without controversy. Where presidents have previously nominated and appointed the Chief Justice, some have pointed out flaws in the system, calling for wider participation by both the judicial sector and the public for multiple candidates. Joining us now to discuss the matter is Mbegezeli Benjamin, Research and Advocacy Officer of the Judges Matter campaign. Mbegezeli, good evening and welcome to the News Feed Late Night. Thank you for joining us.
Good evening, Tobin. Good evening to your viewers.
So it's important then that we follow this process and this appointment of the new Chief Justice. We have seen, be it anecdotally, some reports of political interference or the politics of the country playing a part in these appointments. Talk to me about what your feeling is about the role of the President and the role of the Judicial Services Commission that they should play in the appointment of the Chief Justice.
So the Constitution sets out the process for the appointment of the Chief Justice. And the Section 174 of the Constitution puts it quite clearly in the hands of the President. The President has a controlling power over the appointment process, but of course he determines how the process will unfold. He could either follow a closed process or an open process. So the closed process is when he consults with only a few stakeholders like the JSC and political leaders in Parliament. But we are calling for a more open process where he also consults with the general public on who should be the next Chief Justice of South Africa.
What are the steps for somebody who might be encountering this for the first time? How is the nomination conducted? How is the shortlisting conducted? And how does then the President make the decision? Does he make a decision from 2 names that are given to him, 3 names that are given to him? How do we get to that point?
So traditionally, the President has picked one name, actually, has put forward one name for Chief Justice. So remember, Chief Justice Langa, President Mbeki picked him, Chief Justice Ngobo, President Zuma picked him, and also Chief Justice Mogoeng was also picked by President Zuma. So the President picks a name, and then he submits it to the Judicial Service Commission, which interviews that candidate and determines whether or not he or she is appointable. And then the President then has to consult with leaders of the political parties in the National Assembly, and they give him their views on the suitability of that particular candidate. And then from there, the President makes the appointment. Importantly, the President is not obliged by the views of either the JC or the members of Parliament. He can consider their views and make the appointment after having considered their views. And this is what we call the closed process. And that's the process that has been followed since the early 2000s, in fact, because in 1996 there was a slightly different process that was followed.
So the President has, as you're putting it, the sole discretion, far more discretion, in fact, in choosing the Chief Justice. What are the dangers of that? What are the red flags that you're concerned about?
So, the one red flag that we see in this process is that the possibility exists that the President may pick someone, and during the interview process, for example, because the interviews are held publicly, during that interview process, certain information can come out which is either embarrassing or damaging to the candidate, and they may no longer be appointable, for example. That is the one big risk. But there is another concern that people generally have, that the President has a little bit too much power over this process, or he has too much discretion in this process. But that is a debate on how the Constitution is structured itself. And some may say that in the wisdom of the drafters of the Constitution, they determined that the President should hold a little bit more power in that process. But we say the one way to balance those concerns is to have an open process where the President calls for nominations, for example, and says, look, I'm considering appointing the next Chief Justice. the general public, South Africans, give me names. Who can I put forward as a candidate? And then all of us can input into that process, and then the president can pick one or two names from the list and can submit it to the JSC process and the members of parliament, and then make an appointment finally from that. So it's in the hands of the president, because even in the way that you'll recall the National Director of Public Prosecutions, Advocate Shamila Butoi, she was appointed in a process like that. The Constitution does not require the president to subject the head of the NPA to interviews, but that is a process that President Ramaphosa chose to follow, and so we're hoping that he'll follow the similar process when it comes to the Chief Justice.
Now, this issue, of course, this debate of raising more than one candidate to choose from was debated in 2011 when the Chief Justice Mogoeng Mogoeng's name was forwarded as the candidate. Should we consider more than one candidate? What is your feeling? Where are you sitting on that?
Look, yes, you're right in that in 2011 it was considered, and in fact, Justice Musteneke in his book, he does say that he was approached to be an alternative candidate to Chief Justice Mogoeng, and he thought it would be far too divisive for him to put his name forward as a candidate, and so he thought it was best that one candidate actually follows through. Those are legitimate concerns. But we see that the circumstances back then are different from the circumstances that exist currently. We are still a year ahead of the appointment being made, and so there's still a lot of time for the general public to be involved in the appointment of the Chief Justice. The one benefit of having a more open process where more candidates are put forward is that it legitimizes the process. We see that the president is seriously considering the merits of a particular candidate. He's asking for our opinion on this very important decision, and he is actually asking the JSC to assess the merits of the different candidates and advise him on who would be the best among the two or the three that are put forward. And so an open process, we think it's beneficial for just democratic process. But of course, the president is not obliged or held onto either process. He can choose what works best for him, but we see that there's a lot of value in actually having a more open process with more candidates.
So that would call then for a change of the Constitution, would it not? Because then the JSC, for example, would need to be given that right in law to be able to bring up a nomination, or even political parties to suggest a nominee.
Not necessarily. The Constitution says that the president appoints a Chief Justice after consulting the JSC and the political parties in parliament. So he makes the appointment. It does not necessarily say that he nominates. It just says he makes the appointment. So in the way that the Constitution is currently structured, it allows for a process, an open process, where the president can say, can I get nominations? And then based on these nominations that I receive, I will then consult the Judicial Service Commission and the leaders of political parties represented in Parliament. And after consulting them, then I will arrive at a name which I will appoint. So he can still make the appointment. It's in his hands whether he decides to follow a more open consultative process or a more closed process and more straightforward process where he simply consults with the JSC and members of Parliament on a single name and then makes an appointment based on that.
Did the Constitution envisage a situation where, I mean, only one candidate would mean that the decision of the president will not be undermined?
So it's interesting because it's not clear what the Constitution envisaged. So the tradition of only one name being put forward is a tradition that was followed in the early 2000s to the present. But in 1996, for example, when Chief Justice Ismail Mohammed was appointed, there were two names that were put forward. It was Chief Justice Mohammed, who was the eventual appointee, but there was also another name, Judge Henk van Heerden, was put forward as a name. So there were two names that were put forward to the president, and the president picked one. So it's not unheard of. It's not something that has not been done in history. It's just that traditionally, the one name closed process is the one that has been followed. But President Ramaphosa is not bound to that process.
Now, we've seen, in, for example, the appointment of the public protector, those interviews being conducted and political parties bringing certain things from the past of whichever candidate is on, and those things being challenged, and eventually those become the determining factors into who gets appointed really, or who at least gets shortlisted in those names of candidates. Will it not be a challenge for a president to say, I mean, if you've given us one name, even if there are skeletons in the closet in the past, because there's just one candidate, that's all you have, you will go ahead and appoint that candidate?
Well, that is precisely the risk that is open when you follow this closed process of only having one name, is that that one candidate is put forward, and again, like you say, during the interviews, who knows what skeletons may come out of that candidate, and that from those skeletons, it can possibly be found that that candidate is not even appointable. And so the process has to restart again. But with having two names, for example, whatever skeletons may pop out of the closet, then at least you have another name to put forward of a candidate that is still appointable, a candidate that will still have credibility and legitimacy coming out of the process. Because that's the most important thing, is that whatever process is followed, the credibility of the institution of the judiciary and the head of the judiciary, the Chief Justice, is the most important thing that must be safeguarded. So whichever process, the president has to have an eye on the credibility of the process, and whoever comes out must have the respect of everyone in South Africa.